Okay, class. I'm going over at the request of some students the quizzes, and I'll start with the first quiz. And as I go over them, I'll also kind of talk to you about my thinking on these, and maybe this will help you understand or give you a sense of what I'm looking for the midterm. So the first thing I want to say is try to treat the material in the course, try to treat it as a story. So the Devaka, just this very dramatic story of a castaway who washes up on the Texas shore and hangs out in Texas for a while. What's now Texas? It wasn't Texas at the time. And then ends up back in, reunited with the Spanish. So generally speaking, I'm not a big dates and names person. Sorry about that. Although you do need to know some dates and names, but I try to be really specific about that. So if you see a date and a name on the outline that I post, remember I post an outline with every podcast, and that's really the spine of your study guide, the outlines that I post. Um, uh, that's something that I test you on. So if I put it on the outline, if I talk about it on the podcast, you will there's a good chance you'll see it on the midterm. It's not 100%, but I feel like I can test you, and I'm not getting too in the weeds or too picky or doing the things that make students hate history. So start with the story first and try to fit the details into the story. And what I always tell students is pick something that you watch on, there's so many streaming platforms now. Let's say Netflix, a series that you watch. Game of Thrones was popular. I never liked it, but anyway, I know it was popular. And think about the questions I could ask you from Game of Thrones. And if you're really a Game of Thrones fan, I could ask you super picky questions because you're into the story. And if you think about the story, the details start making sense. And the details become what I call sticky. It's just easier to remember. So think about the big story that I talk about in the quizzes that I give, and think story first and then detail second. Okay, so in this case, I'll go over this. I'm showing this on the screen. I've talked about the Karankawa I had you read on week one about the Karankawa, the Indians that lived on the coast, very fascinating group of indigenous people who lived on the Gulf Coast of Texas. And really all over the place, there were discussions about how Devaka washed up among the Karankawa. And the other thing is that the reading, and it's very dramatic in the reading, the Karankawa were initially quite nice to the Spanish. So the answer here is you can see it, the Karankawa, the first encounter of Devaka was with the Karankawa, and he encountered the Spanish. And I'm sorry, I'm stumbling over my words here. The first group of Indians that Karankawa encountered oh my God, I did it again. The first group of Indians that Devaka encountered were the Karankawa, and they were nice to him, which was a big mistake. They should have killed him. They should have killed all the Spanish because they got disease from the Spanish, which is something I talk about in the podcast as well. So I talked about all this in the podcast. It was in the reading, and I just thought it was a very, very interesting detail. Another question, the second question, Devaka's party had started from Cuba and they were originally going to Florida. And again, just a detail that in some ways, I test you on this because I want you to listen to the podcast. And I'm getting a sense that students can do okay in this class without listening to the podcast. And I find that super annoying. So I'm starting to get a little bit into the details of the podcast without driving you nuts. It's kind of a balance because I don't want to go to war with students. I'm really student friendly. But on the other hand, I want students to learn too, and I want them to do the work, and I don't want to be seen as just some easy professor. You take the class because this class because I'm easy. No professor likes that. So anyway, that was a detail from the podcast. I showed you the map. If you were alert at all, you could have gotten that answer right. What did Devaka call Galveston Island? He called it the island of ill fate or misfortune. And in this very striking scene, which I think I talk about in the podcast, it's certainly in the reading for Devaka. The Karankawa, they sit and cry when the castaways, the Spanish, try to escape because they feel sorry for them. And what strikes me about that is that it's very hard for us to get into the mind of the Karankawa Indians, but here we can get into the mind of this group because they feel pity. And so across a 500-year time gap, we can relate to a people that we would have no other way of relating to as well. But again, this is something that was in the reading, the Devaka reading, and it was something I talked about. And it was also, I think, the island of misfortune or ill fortune. I think that was in the outline that I posted. And I hope you're looking at those outlines while you're listening to the podcast. And if I were you, my notes, if you are taking notes, would be based on the outlines that I'm putting, because this semester I'm working harder than I ever have in terms of giving you very, very specific outlines and trying to break down the information for you so it doesn't make you nuts. I mean, it's still a lot of information, but I'm trying to be clear about what it is I'm writing. I'm testing you on. Number 4. Again, I talk about this in the podcast. Once Devaka reunites with the Spanish as he makes it all the way to the Pacific, he's horrified because he's come to respect the native groups that he encounters, and they're in awe of him. And the Spanish that he encounters near the Pacific, they want the Indian groups, the native groups that he's with, they want to take them as slaves because they don't want to work them near to death. And Devaka's horrified by that. And it's one of the things he writes about because he's telling the King of Spain. Okay, so in number 5, the Karankawa Indians, indigenous group. I talk about that. I lecture about it. You read a little bit about the Karankawa. I want you to know about them and how they differ from other Indian groups because they're fascinating. And a lot of the people from this class either are from the Gulf Coast or you come down here on vacation. And I want you to have a sense of what was here before you got here about 500 years ago. So the Karankawa were nomadic. They moved around. They had a healthy diet. In fact, their diet was healthier than the Spanish, much healthier than the Spanish. And the Karankawa, until they got disease from the Spanish, were much healthier than the Spanish. One of the things I'm trying to get across in this course is that the native groups that the Spanish encountered, we always tend to put the Europeans on top, but certainly in this part of in Texas anyway, the Spanish were actually inferior to the Indian groups that it encountered, especially the Comanche, but even the Karankawa. Then the Caddo. I talked about the Caddo. I had you read something on the Caddo. They were the one group that was sedentary. They had peaked before the Spanish got here a couple of hundred years ago. They had more of what we would think of when we think about a civilization. And so I think those were the only 2 Indian groups that I talked about. And I thought it was pretty clear the difference between them. And I want you to know about the Caddo and the Karankawa. Number 7, someone's mowing outside. I talked about this, I think, in the podcast, but it's in the reading. The Devaka describes his fellow Spaniards as Christians. And I just think it's interesting because this self-identification, it was very important to them. And it's one of the ways they define themselves against the native groups that they encounter, even though the native groups that they encounter, like I say, are healthier, they're stronger, they feel sorry for the Spanish. The Spanish come in feeling like they're top dogs, but it doesn't work out really that way. So the Christians, number 8, very dramatic incident. It's written about, and if you've done the reading, I think this would have stuck out to you. That there's the group of Spaniards that wash ashore, at least some of them, they start cannibalizing each other, and the Kronk were just horrified by that. I think I talked about that in the podcast too. Anyway, I just thought that was a detail. If you did the reading, I mean, cannibalism should jump out at you, I would think. So that's number 8. Number 9, I talk a lot about disease, and this was especially true for the Karankawa Indians. They should have killed the Spanish, but they didn't. And because of that, the Karankawa immediately, and Devaka talks about this, half of them die within a year. So I talk about the importance of disease, and here's another instance of it. And by the way, disease would affect Indian groups and our native groups, indigenous groups, and European groups throughout the history of this course. Number 10, again, Devaka grew to respect the native groups that he encountered. And this is one of the things I really admire about him. And one of the reasons I want you to learn about him. And to go back to an earlier question, it's one of the reasons that he was so horrified when he encountered his Spanish comrades after walking nearly across North America. Number 11, same, the Caddo. I just wanted you to learn about the Caddo, but you know what? If you did the this should have been a pretty straightforward question for you. And I only asked you to to learn about 2 Indian groups in the first part of the course. So the Caddo, and I guess there are only 11 questions. So that's quiz number 1.